Hi everybody, this is Miss Huval, and this video is for English 3 AP. It's intended to help you with your in-class writing assignment on your Native American packet. That packet includes 4 selections: the myth, The World on the Turtle's Back, the Iroquois Constitution, a selection from Benjamin Franklin, and also one from Andrew Jackson. You need to have read all 4 of those before you watch this video. It's not intended to summarize them. In fact, it is intended to help you answer the questions on your in-class writing assignment. So it's not going to make much sense if you haven't read them. Now, you've got 3 questions on that assignment. You only have to answer 2 of them. Everyone has to do number 1, so let's talk about that one first. That one is about the World on the Turtle's Back, which we read mostly in class, in the Iroquois Constitution, which you read on your own. And the question asks you to get at the level of sophistication we see in the way these Native American communities were set up. Okay? So in The World on the Turtle's Back, it begins with a whole creation story. There was an upper world, a sky world, and there was a vast expanse of ocean. And this woman fell out of the sky world, or maybe she was pushed out by her husband. She was pregnant. And things happen. There's a turtle. She plants a root from the sky world, and this world is created. She walks around in a circle with her daughter a certain way. That's why the earth, everything seems to rotate in that way. So those aspects of the myth are pretty much straight creation. Later in the myth, they start to talk about where the crops come from, but then the whole left-handed twin and right-handed twin come in. And this is where we kind of see this battle between good and evil, but also a really keen awareness of the fact that pure goodness and pure evil are not out there, that there seems to be a yin and a yang. So while the left-handed twin, and you could go through the things that he contributes to the world. The left-handed twin seems to be, the one who comes up with the poisonous plants and the carnivores and the predators. Still, his existence is vital to the community, and everything that civilization needs can't always come from the right-handed twin. So that's a very complex and interesting way of viewing human nature, of viewing the natural world. Okay, that balance between the two. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for in your answer to number 1. And I know that you know there are lots of examples of that from the myth. Now, the ending of the myth talks more about how they resolve their problems. Okay, so the right-handed twin and the left-handed twin know that they can't both keep on being in charge of the world. And so the whole way that ends with the left-handed twin and the right-handed twin and the sacrifice and the way it's negotiated, you need to look back over those things and include some of that in your essay as well. Now remember, I said essay, I meant essay question. Don't get too nervous. It's only 2 paragraphs you have to write for number 1. It needs to include stuff that we've mentioned from The World on the Turtle's Back, but it also needs to include information from the Iroquois Constitution. Now there is a lot of stuff in the Iroquois Constitution that shows very sophisticated thought about the way that these tribes come together and the systems that are set in place to make things fair and equitable. Everybody has a certain job. No one person makes a decision. The way things are presented over the course of the Constitution shows a lot of that sophistication. So the idea that these tribes are coming together and that anyone who agrees to abide by the rules set forth has a welcome place in the League of Tribes who make this up. It's called the Council of the Great Peace. Okay, so that's a pretty important pretty important aspect. There is a system of checks and balances in place. And so you might want to mention that specifically. Now, in your answer, you can't just say there's a system of checks and balances in place. You would have to go back to the text, and you would have to come up with a specific example, and you would have to cite it. All right? So there is almost like a bicameral system. That means a two-house system. Now, one house doesn't make all the decisions, sort of like we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. They've got two bodies who discuss things, make decisions, and then they have a process by which each okays it. So once again, in your answer, you can't just say they have a bicameral system. You have to say, for example, and then show exactly what they do that is the bicameral system. Okay? Another couple things I noticed in there, there are amendments. They amend things from time to time. And once again, you'd have to say in what context they allow these amendments. Their term limits. All sorts of things that we find in sophisticated, quote unquote. You might be thinking our world isn't so sophisticated and the messes we get ourselves in, but the same concepts on how to govern and how to be fair and equitable are present in the Constitution. Okay, the Iroquois Constitution. So that should help you with question number 1. Now, you also have to do either number 2 or number 3. Number 2 asks you to take a look at what misconceptions that Benjamin Franklin seems to be addressing about Native Americans in his piece, Notes Concerning the Savages. And then, what do we see happening in the piece by Andrew Jackson that lets us know that these misconceptions are still prevalent in the culture of the time? Because Benjamin Franklin's piece was written in 1784, and Andrew Jackson's piece was written in 1829. Okay, so that's a pretty big time difference. But you see them addressing the same misconceptions from a different point of view. If you think about Benjamin Franklin, and we'll talk about him first, his title is Notes Concerning the Savages. Okay, but it's very clear when you get to the end of his piece that he doesn't view Native Americans as savages. And the whole point that he's trying to make in this essay is that we think that we do things the right way and that we have reasons, and when I say we, I mean people of that time period. You know, we are thinking that we are doing things the right way. Well, they think the very same things. And they are basing their evaluation on what's useful to them and their priorities and their culture in the same way that Benjamin Franklin is saying that white culture does at the time. So there's lots of different examples of that. And he does a real good job of setting forth this tone that kind of pulls people in and at the same time shows them their misconceptions, right? And he does that with a great argument. Now, the second question asks you to talk about ethos and logos. So I'm going to kind of talk about both, all right? So the argument that Benjamin Franklin makes is structured with lots of evidence, okay? He has 3 main claims, and his claims are that the Native Americans and their white settlers have different views about time well spent. You know, what do we prioritize and what do we think time well spent is? His second claim is that Native Americans and white settlers have different ideas about how to conduct oneself in a group. And the third claim has to do with how we treat strangers and how we treat each other in business transactions. But in each of those claims, he shows what the white settlers believe to be the right thing, and then what the Native Americans believe to be the right thing. So let's take, for example, the first claim, which is What is time well spent? Well, this is where we get into the example about the Indian rule of politeness, is where you don't answer immediately. You listen to everything that the other person says, and then you answer, but you answer without contradicting the truth of what that person was saying. So that's where we get the little anecdote. And if you remember, an anecdote is a story about the Native Americans and the white settlers trying to say, why don't you send us some of your young men and we will give them a college education. And at first, the idea is that, okay, we'll send them. But the Native American ends up telling them afterwards that, we sent you our young men and they came back to us useless, unable to hunt, having forgotten how to pass quietly through the woods, and they weren't any good for the things that we value our young men to be able to do, to be our warriors and things like that. So it's not that the level of sophistication isn't there. It's that their lives were based on different ways of surviving. And so the things that the white settlers valued, like education, weren't really useful to the way the Native Americans lived their life. And the way they educated their young men and their young women was what helped to perpetuate their culture. Okay? So that's his first claim. The second claim talks about politeness and rules of civility, okay? And it talks a lot about who's in charge and how they conduct business, which goes back to the Iroquois Constitution, although in these two questions I don't want you to talk about the Iroquois Constitution. This one is about non-interrupting and how warriors have their place in the great councils, but that the old men are the ones who conduct the business, okay, of the tribe, and they avoid disputes. They don't interrupt. They don't accuse people of being a liar or anything like that. And Benjamin Franklin contrasts that with the way that the white settlers conduct their business, like the House of Commons in England. The yelling, the screaming, the booing, the interrupting, and all that kind of stuff. And the anecdote, so that was your example, the House of Commons versus the way the councils run things with no interrupting and with respect and civility. And the bottom line there is that, maybe Benjamin Franklin is saying that the Native Americans might have it figured out more than we do, right? So the anecdote that went along with that claim had to do with the missionary. Okay, so the Native Americans sat and listened to the Bible story and then said, that's a great story. And it was something about an apple, you eat a bad apple or something like that. And he said, well, it's true. You shouldn't eat a bad apple. Much better to make cider with the bad apple. And then he proceeds to tell a creation story to the missionary. Well, the missionary gets all bent out of shape and says, hey, wait a minute. I am telling you truths of the universe, and you are coming back at me with stories about how corn got to be grown. And the Native American makes the observation, well, hey, you must not have been brought up in the right way at all, because you're being extremely rude. And we listened to your story, and now you should have the decency to sit there and listen respectfully to our story. So once again, the underlying thing that Benjamin Franklin's trying to say is that we think we're so civilized. Maybe they're civilized in their own way that's just different from ours. Okay? So the last one has to do with how we treat strangers, and that would be a great example to use as well. So these are the kind of bits of evidence I want you to be using. Now, if you were talking about logos and ethos, you can talk about anecdotes, examples, claims. Now, for ethos with Benjamin Franklin, in what way is he credible? Well, you could use his entire tone. The way he seems to be coming at it as, oh, these are the savages. And then by the end of it, it's clear that he doesn't view them as savages at all and is being kind of critical of the white settlers and their views of civility and manners and how to treat other people. So we move on to Andrew Jackson, which was farther, 60 years down the road, time-wise. We see that the same misconceptions are there. Now, what does he use as evidence? Well, he's got a lot of evidence to suggest that the Indian removal is going to be the best thing for the United States and the best thing for the Native Americans. And he's got two tribes on board already. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw Indians are on board already with this removal. In other words, they're taking away their land in I think it's in the Mississippi River Valley, and moving them west. All right. So Andrew Jackson, of course, is the President of the United States, so he's a good bit of credibility there. And he's also somebody, if you know anything about Andrew Jackson, you know, the Battle of New Orleans, the War of 1812, he's a great hero. But he is widely regarded historically now as someone who was extremely unfair to the Native Americans. You'd never know it from reading this, though, because in this selection, it is all about how great that the U.S. government is being to the Native Americans, all right? He starts out with words like our benevolent policy, the happy consummation, obvious advantages that this policy gives the Native Americans. He starts off with paragraph 2 talks about the benefits to the United States, their financial advantages. We won't be fighting with the Native Americans anymore. Our western frontier is going to be strengthened against foreign invasion because it's going to be populated with U.S. citizens. And it's going to make the states more populous and more wealthy. Now, the benefits to the Native Americans start in the next paragraph. He says they're going to be able to operate under their own laws. It's going to lessen the diseases that have decimated their numbers. And maybe they'll become Christianized and civilized. He says we're not going to give up on that. Right. So, he says in the next bit that Native Americans aren't citizens. So it would be us trying to get in there and make government policies and enforce them for them would be like us trying to do that to a foreign government. It just doesn't work. And so we got to stop trying to do that. We've got to give them their own place and let them be happy where they are. All right? And so it's always their hope that it's always the hope of Andrew Jackson and this benevolent United States government that this removal is going to lead to changes for them. Once, for one, they won't be subject to the diseases. They'll be able to follow their own rules, and hopefully, eventually, they'll learn the ways of civilized people. Okay? Now, he also includes a counterclaim, and if you're doing the logos and the pathos one, logos and ethos ones, this is going to be really helpful to you. He uses counterclaim. He says, some people say that it's not fair to ask them to leave the graves of their ancestors and to move west. He says, well, white settlers who've come to this country, every one of them has left the graves of their ancestors and found a better and a new life in the new world. He says, so maybe it'll be fine for the Native Americans and they can do that as well. And he says not only that, we've paid to purchase their land, we've paid for their passage to the new place where they're going to go, and we've agreed to give them money for a year to support them in their new abode. Okay? Now we all know via the Trail of Tears that all of this didn't exactly transpire the way he's making it seem like it's going to. But that's his counterclaim that he makes. No, it's not unreasonable to ask them to leave the land of their ancestors because, of course, the white settlers did that when they left Europe, etc., etc. All right, so his arguments show, okay, the same concept, that Benjamin Franklin's arguing against, that the Native Americans can't live in harmony with the white settlers, that they're not civilized, that they are somehow doing it wrong, and we're just going to have to leave them out there to do their own thing, because there's no way that we can come together and live peacefully amongst each other. So he shows those same things. He relies on his ethos of being the president and the war hero, and he relies very heavily on his diction to show that he's the good guy. He's doing nice things for the Native Americans. Okay? All right, so hopefully that's going to help you. You're doing 2 paragraphs on number 1, you're picking number 2 or number 3, and you're doing 2 paragraphs on that one. And you've got to be sure in each one that you answer, you're pulling from 2 different sources, and that you're using in-text citations and quoted material. All right? Hope that helps. We'll see you at school.